So I like to. I think it's a modest expense considering how expensive it is to rebuild an engine. Most folks won't even rebuild one anymore because honestly, you can go buy one assembled with a warranty, probably cheaper than you can build one. Which is a shame because these are kind of fun. I like to do this, and if you like to do this, then you understand that there's a certain level of satisfaction of assembling your own engine. Plus, you got no one to blame if it gets messed up, right? So I like to buy these. It's a ring compression tool, and this one's made for Summit, and you can see this one is a 4.060 bore ring compressor. That's the bore of the engine. Standard bore 350 is 4.000. This is 60 thousandths overboard, so I got a 4.060 ring compressor. And basically the way that works is it's got a small end, which you can see this narrow ridge on the bottom and then a fat ridge, and so it's tapered. You want the taper to go towards the block, so this is going to slide inside of here, and that will compress the rings as it goes down into the cylinder until it matches the size of the cylinder wall, and then we can install it. So we'll go ahead and we're going to put oil on this, obviously, so this slides in nice and easy. You don't want to do this dry, so we're going to squirt some engine oil on this and slide it down through the bore. We've already wiped down the engine bores with clean oil and got that all prepped and ready. So now I'll get these set up and then I'll show you how I install them. All right, so went ahead and loosened up all these. They're all torqued when they arrive because they have them sized. But the rod bearings are pretty straightforward. The notch lines up with the notch on the rod. And then in the main cap, or in the rod cap, you'll also notice it has a notch in it. You can take another one of these, line it up with the notch, and then rotate it into position until it's flush. And there's your rod bearing. You'll notice that these Eagle rods have a dowel that aligns with the rod, and it makes it fit correctly so that you don't have any issues when you're installing these. But essentially what you have to be mindful of is that these do have to go on the correct way. They cannot go on backwards, for example. And one of the giveaways that it's on backwards, or that it's going on backwards, is that the faces don't line up here and here. But even more so, you want the notch on the cap and the notch on the rod to be on the same side. So that's going to line up like this. Just an FYI. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and fit all the rod bearings on all the caps. Do not mix up caps. Keep the cap with the piston that it belongs to. So in this case, this cap's going to stay here with this piston so that it's a matching set. You don't want to break that set. Don't want to mess that up. And if you really want to play it safe, you can actually write with Sharpie a number on the cap and on the rod so that they go together. I'm just going to be extra careful. So, all right, so all the rod bearings are installed. I am a big fan of this. I don't get paid to use any of this stuff. Zero sponsors, zero. I'm not beholden to anybody here, so I'll just say that up front. But I do like this Royal Purple Max Tough assembly lube. It is sticky, it's tacky. I've had engines that I've assembled and stored up for a couple years, primed the oil pump, and I had no issues. So I do like this stuff a lot. So in saying that, it's not like terribly expensive relative to other assembly lubes. Like I have Federal Mogul assembly lubricant that came with the kit, and I'm not going to use it. I just much rather use this stuff. So yeah, spend a little bit extra money, but in the long run, if it does what I need it to do, and it does it in a way that helps me feel good about it, and I get warm and fuzzy feelings about it, I guess that's all good then, right? But I don't know if you can hear this, but it's really super sticky, tacky, slippery, which I Really like that a lot, and I like that in an assembly lubricant. I don't like using grease. It's too thick and it has hard properties when it comes to priming oil pumps and stuff, so I'd just rather not use it. And then let's go back to these rod bolts and this ARP fastener lubricant. So what I do is I just put like a little dab on the end of the threads, roll it around, and then I hold the bolt like this and put some under the ledge so that when I torque these, I know I'm going to get a good reading. I'm not going to use a stretch gauge on these. This is not a high performance engine. This is an engine that I'm going to use on the business to pull a media blasting trailer. So it's just not something that I'm going to need to get wild and crazy with. The cam selection I chose is good for that purpose, and I'm not going to push this thing hard. I want it to last forever. So that's the goal. Alrighty, I'm going to go ahead and put one of these in just to give you an idea what it looks like. So I'm going to get my ring compressor and my oil can, and I'm going to put some engine oil on this just because I want it to have a fighting chance of sliding in there. Double check my ring gaps. So I've got my top ring at 2 o'clock, second ring at 10 o'clock, top oil scraper 9 o'clock, my gap in the expanding at 6, and my bottom at 3. Whether 6 and 9 o'clock get mixed up really isn't super important, so I'm not gonna worry too much about that. So pretty much best way to do this is to get the ring started in the assembly tool and get them to like where they're about flush, where the piston's about flush with the top. Remember, this goes to the front of the engine, so I'm going to go ahead and carefully slide this in. You don't want the rod to make contact with the crankshaft. You want that to be as protected as you can. You don't want to put a nick in the crankshaft. That would be pretty bad. I also, not to, sound like I'm a Summit advertisement, but I bought this Summit piston knocker hammer dead blow just because it does a great job in getting the piston down into the cylinder. It's got a long reach. So you want something with about 6 inches of reach in it, just to get you in the ballpark. Very carefully. When the piston is flush with the deck of the block, the ring compressor will fall off of it, which is what happened. So we will finish. Of course, when you hear that solid sound, you know that you're completely on the crankshaft. You just don't want to drag anything on it, or create a situation where we're going to nick the crankshaft, because we certainly don't want to do any of that. So I always use probably more assembly lube than I should, but I'd rather have a little bit of a mess than to not have enough. So remember, our notch on the rod cap is going to match the notch on the rod itself, and our notch is here, so we know that this one goes here. Tap this on. Just like that. And then our pre-lubricated bolts. And there's no harm in doing this, as long as you don't get carried away with it. It saves a bit of time. Not that time is really a factor here. It's easier to hold a tool and part in your other hand and assemble it than it is to try to manage all that without a third hand. So there's our number one. So on a Chevy small block, the front most forward cylinder is 1, which is this one. So it'd be the driver's side. Driver's side front cylinder is 1. The next one is 3. The next one 5. The last one is 7. And then on the passenger side, number 2 will go here. Number 4 will go here. Number 6 will go here. And number 8 will go there. So that's basically how that works. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll put one more in just so that we can repeat that process. And I won't narrate as much. Probably is annoying. So just check the ring gaps and get our rings lined up correctly. And then we're going to lubricate this well, just so that we're not assembling this dry. And then we're going to put this with the taper in the correct orientation. Put our piston in it like that. Put plenty of assembly lube on it. Going to slide this in without dragging it on anything, with the dot on the piston facing the front of the engine. That's how we want it oriented. And that appears as though that's going to work. I won't have to turn the crank. Sometimes you have to rotate the crankshaft too, because the rod can't. Our ring compressor. And there's that solid sound we were after. Our thread assembly lube. Just like that. Get our main cap. Look for that notch on the bearing and the notch on the rod. Line those two up. And this is where I was talking about having to rotate the crankshaft because I can't get this bottom rod bolt in there. So a couple ways to rotate it. I think what I'm going to do is snug that just to be safe. A couple ways. You can put a bolt in the end of the crankshaft down on the harmonic balancer side of it. You can put a couple bolts in the rear of the crankshaft flange and use like a bar to rotate it. Or you can do, I have a piece of aluminum that I actually can put on the counterweight to rotate it. That won't harm anything. And I can rotate this up out of the way. Oops, that ain't gonna work. There we go. Just have to rotate it enough to get that bolt in there. Okay. Nope, not quite enough. So that's the second one. I'm going to go ahead and put the rest of them in, and I will show you the next step. All right, all the piston rod assemblies are installed. I'm going to go ahead and torque it. I have ARP 8740 cap screws in here, and those require 40 foot-pounds of torque. So I've got my torque wrench set to 40 foot-pounds, and I'm going to tighten these one at a time. So there's those. All right, now I'm going to rotate the engine to get the other 4 tightened. Check them. All right, all double checked. All right, next thing we're gonna install is the camshaft, and to do that I've got to get the lifters ready. So I'm going to rotate this over. There we go. Get all this extra oil off. We'll clean this really good before we put the heads on, but there you go. So you can see all the cylinders are pointed, all the pistons are pointed forward in the cylinders. This is the front of the engine. The dots indicate the front of the engine. And that is a big part of this assembly. So next we'll put the cam in. To install the camshaft is very simple, but you do need to be mindful of a couple things. One is camshaft will come with some lubricant for assembly, and I do not do anything other than what they sent me. So in this case, it's like a molybdenum lithium composition lubricant, and it's specially made for camshafts. It says camshaft assembly lube, and it came with a cam, so I'm not going to deviate from that. Roller cams and hydraulic flat tappet cams are different, and they're going to need a different break-in procedure, a different kind of setup. So you put the lubricant, as you can see, on every cam lobe and on the distributor gear. And I like to use assembly lube on the journals, and I use quite a bit because I like to have bearing lubricant on the actual camshaft bearings because they tend to need the bearing lubricants that are made more for bearing surfaces and less for cam lobes. So that being said, install the camshaft carefully, and I'm installing it backwards, so that's probably not helping. That's okay, we've pre-lubricated some of the bearings now, so let's go ahead and put this in correctly. So the distributor gear goes to the back on a small black Chevy, not the front like Ford. So we put plenty of lubricant on the bearing surfaces. In the camshaft, the special lubricant that it uses for the lobes and for the distributor gear. To be careful installing this, you can tell lines up very carefully. When you get to the end, you can use a bolt in the end of this to help lift it. But in my case, I'm just going to use my hand. Second that, I'm going to use a bolt. With that bolt as a handle, you can go ahead and install the camshaft in all the way. So it will be in a position where you can put some leverage on it and slide it in the rest of the way. All right, so lifters, same thing. Lifters have to have some assembly lubricant on the ends. So these are pre-lubed. We soak them in oil, motor oil. Put some assembly lube on the actual lifter itself. And it goes in like so. So I'm going to reposition the camera. Pretty much just want to show you so I can rotate this a little bit, maybe give you a better look of the lifter bores. So essentially each lifter has its own lifter bore. There's 16 of them on a V8 small block Chevy. But the idea here is you want to get this break-in cam lube on the end of the lifter like that. You want some assembly lube on the outside bore so it slides freely in and out of the bore. And you want to pre-soak them in oil. That's basically the premise of installation of these lifters. It's just a little prep work. So you soak them in oil, clean them up, put some of this lubricant on the ends where it contacts the camshaft, and then put some assembly lube on the sides so that it stays nice and sticky. And then slide it into the lifter bore like so, and do that 16 times. Easy peasy, right? So I'm going to get the timing set close. I'll explain. So what I'm basically going to do, there's a dot on the cam gear, it's right here, and a dot on the crank gear, which is right here. So I'm going to get these somewhat lined up in advance. Okay, and then there's a dot on the crankshaft gear. We're going to line that up. So without taking too much time here, basically what we're going to do is have our camshaft gear and our crank gear pointed to each other, the dots. I'm going to put the crankshaft on our 0 timing mark on this gear. We're not going to dial in the degree the cam and verify all the specs on the cam. We're just gonna put it together like that, and for what we're using the truck for, that'll be fine. So those two are lined up. So I'm going to put the key on 0 there, and then I'm going to rotate it a little bit so that it points straight up at the cam. Like that. So the 0 is pointed straight up at the cam. It looks like I'm going to be fairly close on that. So then we're going to get this more or less aligned. Pretty darn close. Looks like I'm going to have to get this gear on here a little more. Don't like to hammer on this thing for obvious reasons. There's a thrust bearing on the crankshaft that you don't want to damage. You just need to get it pretty close to where it belongs. So there we are, we're aligned. Camshaft looks aligned. We're going to put blue thread locker on our grade 8 bolts for the cam gear. Just one drop That's all you need. You don't need to put a ton of thread locker on these bolts. Bolts need to be dry and clean before you put the thread locker on them, or the thread locker won't work well. I'm going to get these just barely snugged to the cam, and I will torque these to 31 foot-pounds. Before I torque these and get them all completely tight, I will get this crank gear and that looks like that is on. So 32 foot-pounds. That's set. So that's our timing set. It's on. Now what I like to do, because I'm going to drop a distributor in this thing, and I have a really poor track record of having the distributor set 180 degrees out. So this is a pretty important thing if you'd like to avoid that. What you want to do is rotate the engine until you want one crankshaft rotation. And with one crankshaft rotation, you'll have the cam gear timing mark on the top and the crank timing gear on the top. And then your distributor will drop in on number one and it'll be set correctly. So I won't bore you with that, rotating the engine, but that's what your goal is at the end of this. You want the timing mark on the camshaft to be on the top, the crankshaft timing gear mark to be on the top. This number one cylinder will be all the way on top dead center, and then you'll be able to drop your distributor in on number one, rotator aligned to number one on your distributor cap, and you will be close. So you won't have a 180 degree camshaft out position, which is never a good thing for starting up. So that's that for the timing set.